The timing of this announcement is not accidental. Cancer Research UK chose this week, the week of the UK's hottest ever May Day, the week of the Amber Heat Health Alert, the week that 19 million people took to Britain's roads and beaches in 33-degree Saharan heat, to publish the data that no amount of sunscreen marketing has been able to reverse. In 2022, more than 20,000 people in the UK were diagnosed with melanoma, the most serious and potentially fatal form of skin cancer. That is a record high, a number that has never been higher in the history of UK cancer surveillance. And by 2040, Cancer Research UK's projection places that figure at 26,500 cases a year, rising, climbing, on a trajectory that the organization's own chief executive described as concerning, and that the timing of the announcement during a bank holiday heatwave with UV indices at their peak makes it urgent in a way that data published in February never could be. The warning Sky News is sounding this week is not about one weekend of sunshine. It is about a population whose relationship with UV radiation has never been more dangerous, precisely because it has never occurred against a background of weather this extreme, arriving this early, with this level of cultural encouragement to be outdoors. The Cancer Research UK data, published on May 22, 2026, is the most comprehensive picture of UK melanoma incidents ever assembled. More than 20,000 diagnoses in 2022 alone. Rates of melanoma increased by almost a third over the decade between 2007 to 2009 and 2017 to 2019, from 21 to 28 cases per 100,000 people. Among those aged over 80, the rise was 57%. A figure that reflects the accumulated UV damage of lifetimes spent outdoors in an era when sun protection was neither culturally normalized nor scientifically understood at the level it is today. Among those aged 25 to 49, the rise was 7%, a figure that is smaller in percentage terms, but more alarming in its implications, because it represents the generation that grew up with sun safety messaging and is still developing melanoma at an increasing rate. The gender breakdown reveals a specific pattern. Among adults under 55, women are more likely to be diagnosed with melanoma than men, reflecting higher sun exposure from sunbathing and sunbed use in younger female demographics. After 55, that pattern reverses. Men's rates exceed women's, reflecting the cumulative effect of long-term outdoor occupational and recreational sun exposure in a generation of men who worked and recreated outdoors without sunscreen as a routine practice. Michelle Mitchell, Cancer Research UK's chief executive, delivered the organization's central message in terms that require no translation into plain language. It's concerning to see the rising number of people being diagnosed with melanoma skin cancer across the UK. The fact that most of these cases are preventable underlines the importance of people taking sun safety seriously. Nearly 9 out of 10 melanoma cases in the UK are caused by too much UV radiation from the sun and sunbeds. That figure, 90% preventable, is the most important number in the entire dataset. More than 20,000 annual diagnoses, a projected rise to 26,500 by 2040. And 9 in 10 of those cases could be prevented by the same behaviors that are immediately relevant to every person who spent this bank holiday weekend outdoors in 33-degree heat, seeking shade, covering up, applying and reapplying SPF 30 or above sunscreen. The gap between knowing that and doing it consistently, correctly, on every day the UV index reaches 3 or above, is the gap that the Cancer Research UK data is measuring in annual diagnoses. The UV index context for the current bank holiday heat wave is where the cancer warning and the weather story merge into a single public health narrative. The UV index is a standardized scale measuring the intensity of UV radiation reaching the Earth's surface, calibrated so that any reading of 3 or above is sufficient to damage unprotected skin and increase the risk of UV-induced DNA mutation in skin cells. In the UK, the Met Office's UV index guidance indicates that the index can reach 3 or above from the start of April through to the end of September, a window significantly wider than most people's intuitive understanding of when sun protection is necessary. During the current heat wave, with clear skies, minimal cloud cover, and the high solar elevation angle of late May, producing near maximum UV intensity at the surface, the UV index across the southeast of England will be reaching 7 or above, in the high to very high range, during the peak midday hours. At UV index 7, unprotected skin can begin to burn in as little as 15 minutes for a person with fair complexion. At UV index 8 or above, that window narrows further. In a single episode of sunburn, not repeated chronic exposure, a single episode has been documented to double the risk of malignant melanoma. One sunburn, double the risk. The specific demographic groups whose UV exposure patterns make them most relevant to the Cancer Research UK warning during this bank holiday heat wave are worth identifying precisely because they do not map neatly onto the populations most visible in the beach and park coverage. Children are the group whose UV exposure has the most disproportionate long-term impact. UV damage accumulated before the age of 18 is estimated to account for up to 80% of an individual's lifetime UV damage because the DNA repair mechanisms of younger skin are less efficient, and because melanocytes, the pigment-producing cells where melanoma originates, are in active development through childhood and adolescence. A child who burns on a bank holiday beach at age 8 is accumulating UV damage that their skin will carry as a cumulative risk factor for decades. The parent applying SPF 50 to their child every 2 hours is not being overcautious. They are interrupting a damage accumulation process that the Cancer Research UK 2040 projection is measuring in tens of thousands of future diagnoses. The male over 55 demographic, whose melanoma incidence rates exceed women's after midlife, represents a specific and largely avoidable component of the UK's rising case count. This is the generation that worked in outdoor occupations, agriculture, construction, utilities, transport, during the decades when occupational sun protection was neither required nor culturally expected. It is also the generation that took the first wave of affordable package holidays in the 1960s and 1970s, when the ability to get a suntan was aspirationally associated with affluence and leisure in a way that made deliberate UV exposure a social good rather than a health risk. The accumulated UV damage of those decades of unprotected exposure is presenting now as melanoma in a demographic that may not connect their current diagnosis to the sunburns of 40 years ago. The 57% rise in melanoma among those over 80 is the most visible statistical expression of that damage trajectory, and it underlines why Cancer Research UK's warning is not just directed at the family on the beach this weekend, but at every person who has ever been sunburned and who has not yet integrated regular skin checking into their health routine. The 90% preventability figure that Michelle Mitchell highlighted sits alongside a second statistic that Cancer Research UK is equally explicit about. Almost all melanoma cases are curable if detected, diagnosed, and treated early. That second figure transforms the cancer warning from a message of inevitability into a message of agency. The pathway from UV exposure to melanoma diagnosis is not instant. It involves years of cumulative DNA damage, a process of cellular mutation that the immune system attempts to suppress, and a progression from abnormal cell growth to detectable lesion that gives a window for early intervention. The ABCDE criteria that dermatologists use to identify potentially malignant changes, asymmetry, border irregularity, color variation, diameter, greater than 6 millimeters evolution or change over time, are learnable, applicable without specialist. Training and executable with a monthly self-examination routine that takes less than 5 minutes. SKCIN, the UK's skin cancer charity, has been running the Check Your Skin monthly self-examination campaign in parallel with the Cancer Research UK data release, and Ashley Dalton MP specifically cited the campaign in a social media post on May 20th, 2026. The convergence of the record high diagnosis data, the bank holiday heatwave, and the Check Your Skin campaign in the same news cycle is not coincidental. It is coordinated public health communication timed for the moment of maximum UV exposure risk. The NHS's own response to the rising melanoma case count provides the institutional framing for the urgency of the Cancer Research UK warning. Professor Stephen Powis, NHS National Medical Director, confirmed that cancer survival is at a record high, a statement that reflects the progress made in melanoma treatment through immunotherapy and targeted therapy advances that have transformed the prognosis for many stage 3 and stage 4 diagnoses that would previously have been rapidly fatal. But he added that more people are getting diagnosed with melanoma, and nearly 500,000 people were urgently referred for skin cancer checks in the last year. 500,000 urgent referrals in a single year. That is the demand the UK's rising melanoma incidence is placing on a diagnostic pathway that is already managing waiting time pressures across all cancer screening and treatment services. Each bank holiday weekend where UV exposure is elevated, where sunscreen application is incomplete, where sunburn occurs, particularly in children, is adding to the future referral volume that will arrive in GP surgeries and dermatology services across the 2030s and 2040s. The 26,500 annual diagnoses projected for 2040 are not a fixed destination. They are the consequence of the UV exposure decisions being made now, this weekend, on every beach and in every garden, where the UK's 33-degree May heatwave is creating the conditions for the most intense UV damage of the year to date. The sunbed dimension of the UK's melanoma crisis is a component of the Cancer Research UK data that the heatwave context tends to obscure, but which the charity has been explicit about, including in its preventability framing. Sunbeds are classified as a Group 1 carcinogen by the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer. the highest possible carcinogen classification, the same category as tobacco smoke and asbestos. Using a sunbed before the age of 35 increases the risk of melanoma by 59%, according to Cancer Research UK's own published data. Despite the UK's ban on commercial sunbed use by under 18s, implemented through the Sunbeds Regulation Act 2010, the charity's data on younger female melanoma rates, higher than age-equivalent male rates under the age of 55, points to sunbed use as a contributing factor in a demographic where outdoor UV exposure alone does not fully explain the gender gap. The bank holiday heatwave context is relevant to sunbed risk, not because people are using sunbeds during the warm spell, they are overwhelmingly outdoors, but because the pursuit of tan that sunbed use represents is the same cultural driver that produces inadequate sunscreen application, extended unprotected midday exposure, and the deliberate skin exposure during a 33-degree UV index 7 afternoon that Cancer Research UK's entire prevention campaign is directed at interrupting. The NHS diagnostic pathway for skin cancer, through which the 20,000 plus annual melanoma cases are being identified, is itself under pressure from the volume of referrals that the rising incidence generates. The NHS's 2-week wait standard for urgent cancer referrals, the target that suspected cancer cases should be seen by a specialist within 14 days of urgent GP referral, has been consistently missed for skin cancer across multiple years as referral volumes have grown faster than diagnostic capacity. In the year that Professor Powis cited, nearly 500,000 urgent referrals were made for skin cancer checks in England alone. Each of those referrals required a dermatology appointment, potentially a biopsy, potentially staging investigations if melanoma was confirmed, and potentially treatment planning. The dermatology workforce that manages this referral volume is finite, and the gap between the current referral rate, growing with the rising incidence, and the diagnostic capacity of the NHS dermatology service is one that the projected rise to 26,500 annual melanoma diagnoses by 2040 will widen unless either the prevention success that the Cancer Research UK data identifies as achievable is delivered at scale, or significant new investment in diagnostic capacity is made. The bank holiday heatwave that is producing the UV exposure conditions for future melanoma cases in May 2026 is also producing the referrals that will arrive in dermatology services in 2027, 2028, and 2029. The practical guidance that Cancer Research UK, SKCIN, and the UKHSA are simultaneously issuing during this bank holiday heatwave is specific, evidence-based, and applicable to every person currently outdoors in the UV Index 7 conditions across southern England. Apply SPF 30 or higher sunscreen. The Cancer Research UK recommendation specifies at least SPF 30 with 4 or 5-star UVA protection to all exposed skin before going outside, and reapply every 2 hours and after swimming or sweating, regardless of whether the product claims to be waterproof. Seek shade between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. when UV intensity is at its daily maximum. Cover up with clothing including a wide-brimmed hat and UV protection sunglasses. UV damage occurs to eyes as well as skin, and UV-associated eye conditions, including cataracts, are a separately documented consequence of cumulative unprotected UV exposure. Check your skin monthly for any new or changing mole, any sore that does not heal, any area of skin that looks or feels out of the ordinary, and contact your GP promptly if you notice any change rather than waiting for the next routine appointment. The ABCDE criteria: asymmetry, border irregularity, color variation, diameter greater than 6 meter, evolution over time, are the self-examination framework that dermatologists recommend and that takes less than 5 minutes monthly. Early detection transforms a potentially fatal diagnosis into a curable one in the overwhelming majority of cases. The record high diagnosis figure of 20,000 cases in 2022 will not reverse by 2040 without the people most at risk on the hottest and sunniest days of the year treating both the UV index number and their own skin with the same informed attention they give to the temperature forecast sitting next to it on their weather app. This bank holiday weekend, 33 degrees, UV index 7, 19 million people outdoors, is the most consequential moment of the year for that choice.